Hello and welcome to this lesson. So in this lesson, I'm just going to showcase how the London and New York session creates the high or low of the day. So this is just a theory backtesting, and I'll advise that you also go into your charts and do the same, so that you can see actually in your own charts. So whichever pair that you're trading. So I'll be using the Euro USD and the Pound USD just for example, and then I'm using the 15 minutes chart just to view those highs and lows that are formed during each trading day. So let's begin by, so I'm using the week and day separator to showcase the days that basically each trading day. So you can see I'm starting on Thursday, 31st October, then we have Friday, then Monday, so and so on. And then I'm also going to activate this ICT kill zone indicator that is going to, so basically this indicator shows I've only outlined the New York and the London sessions only, so that we can focus on those alone. So you can see actually I don't have Asian session indicated, so I've disabled actually from the indicator. So basically if you look at this, so maybe I can show how maybe I disable that. So I just went to the settings. So anyway, so if you go to the ICT kill zone indicator and then click on settings, then style, then I just scroll down and disable the Asian high, the Asian fill mid, and the Asian low box. So I disable those three, and then that is how I've achieved actually. And then I made sure that I enable the London session and the New York session alone. So basically I'm just going to showcase that the theory that the London session and the New York session forms the high and low of the day majority of the time. That is the theory we're going to look at. So you'll find that sometimes maybe it just falls short of the London session or the New York session. By falling short, I mean if the New York session is ending at 11, sometimes you can see the high or low of the day being created at maybe 12. So that is the only maybe just a slight difference in time between the low being created, but you're going to see here that majority of the time it will form during those two sessions. So basically I'm starting on this Friday, or even if we start on this Thursday, you can see we've already looked at what the high and low of the day is. So I'm just going to actually just quickly outline here if we have formed during the London session or the New York session or not. So you can see from this Friday here, we had that high of the day form at 8:30 a.m. This is the New York session, so you can see it falls inside that New York session. London did not form the low. We had the low being formed post New York, which is at this is the low right here at 16:15 p.m. So but the high was created, so the high was printed during New York session. That is significant. So we are just going to see not every day will be creating the high and low of the day during the two sessions alone, but at least one of them, either the high or the low, will fall inside. So that is what we are interested in. We're interested in a day that the high is formed during the London or New York session, or the low is formed during the London or New York session. In the same trading day, we don't have to see the high and low being formed within those two sessions. We actually prefer to see at least one of them, either the high or the low, forming inside those trading sessions, and that is where now we come in to execute, because we want that move away from that high or low to now basically benefit from it. So if we move to the next day, so maybe I can zoom in a little bit, you can see we had I just wanted to showcase the high here was formed at this is at 7 a.m. so it is just shy of New York session. New York session begins at 8 a.m. so you can see sometimes it can form a bit early or a bit later, maybe a plus or minus 1 hour or so. So the next day we had we did not have the high or the low formed during the either session. We had this high of the day from, actually this is Asian session, no, it's before Asian session. This is 1845. Asian session began at 8 right there. So we had that high formed not in either of the sessions. So the next day we had actually the high is right here at midnight. Then we had the low created at 8 a.m. on the dot. So that is during New York session open. Then the next day we had London did not form the high or low of the day. We had the low at midnight. Then the high was created at 10:30 a.m. So basically that's another scenario where we had the New York session create the high. Then we had this example here where we just fell short. So this is 6:30 a.m. We're creating the high of the day. So if we look at this range, and then the low of the day created at 12 noon. So basically, as I've mentioned, sometimes it might fall short plus or minus 1 hour. Then the very next day, this is on Monday now again, we had the high created at 2 a.m. This is London session. And then the low was created at 9:45 a.m. New York session. So you can see this day actually both sessions created the high and low. So if you took your entry right here, you're benefiting from this entire move. So and then on Tuesday we had actually the low created at 12 noon again. That is just an hour after New York session. So London did not create the high. We had the high at midnight open. And then during this next day, the high of the day was created at 8:30 a.m. This is during New York session, and the low. Okay, if we look at this low, I think we went lower than this. We had this low at 10 a.m., but we went a bit lower. The low being created at, so I'll say this is the lowest low at 22:45 Asian session. So this came in at Asian session. Then the next day, this is the entire day's range. We had the low created at 6 a.m., which is 1 hour after 5 a.m., which is just 1 hour after London sessions close. Then the high came in at 11:15, which is within that range of plus or minus 1 hour after New York session. So, and then the very next day, which is the last example in the Euro USD, we had the high created at 8 a.m., the high of the day, then the low of the day came in at 15:30. So we had, yes, but we had the significant low created at 9:45 during New York session. So I'll say that sometimes the New York session and the London session might not necessarily create the high or low of the day, but definitely it will be creating a significant high or low during those two sessions. So we'll always get a significant high or low during those sessions, majority of the time actually. Sometimes it might not be the high or low of the day, but it will be a significant swing that we can use for our trade interest in this strategy. So let's look at the pound USD. Around the same time we had so maybe if we start on Wednesday, so this day we had the London session. You can see how it creates a significant swing and then drops into New York. This is 8:45 a.m. creating the, I believe, the low of the day, and then the high of the day was created at 10:15. So this movement here is quite significant that you can benefit from. Then the very next day we had a significant high at 3:45 a.m., but the high of the day was I believe this was the high of the day. So you can see this high here is 1.29992. This high was 29,998. So this is 992. This is 998. So this is higher than this. So we had that high of the day created there. Then this high was 29,978. So this was the highest high that was created. It was created at 6:15, and then the lowest low was at 11:45, which was just slightly 15 minutes after New York's close. So basically this falls within that range that we are discussing. And then this day, I believe the low of the day was created here at 1:30 a.m., 30 minutes before London's open. Then the high of the day was right here during Asian. This is at 22:45. We had this significant high created during New York session, but it was not the high of the day, but it was still a significant high. Then the next day is the day's range. We had the high of the day. Yeah, this is the high of the day created at 1 a.m., an hour before London's open. And then we also have this swing low here during London at 4:15, but then another high during New York, although it was not the high of the day, but it was a significant high created during New York session. Then it dropped. Then also we have another scenario here where we have the high of the day being created at 18:45, which is not even during Asian session. Then we had low of the day at 22:30 Asian during Asian session. So you can see here the London or New York session did not create the low or high of the day. So this is another example where we got high of the day at midnight. Yes, this is the highest high of the day, if you can see here. So if I use that line, you can see this is the highest during that entire day. This was the highest high, and then the lowest low was right here. You can see it is the lowest low, which is created at 9:30 a.m. during the New York session. So that's another significant low created. Then we also have this another session, London session, creating a swing high. Then you got that swing low again. Then the highest high of the day, created at this is 10:30 a.m. New York session. We have another example here where we have highest high or high of the day at 6:30 a.m. Then the lowest low at 12:30 p.m. Another example here. This is an example where you're seeing the London session creating the high of the day, which is at 2 a.m. Then the lowest, that's not the low of the day. The low of the day came during Asian session. You can see it came right about there at 23:45 p.m. So, but we had the significant low during the New York session. Then this is another instance where we got the high of the day being created at midnight. Then the low of the day was printed at 12 p.m. So 12 p.m. is actually a very good time to make sure that you have exited your position if you entered maybe this sell. Then this is another instance where we're getting high of the day being created during New York session at 8:30 a.m. Then the low of the day came in during Asian, but we had the significant low at 10 a.m. Another scenario where we created a swing high during London session. Then low of the day was created at I believe 5:30 a.m. That low is at 1.2630. This low is at 1.2629. So this is the low of the day. Sorry, is it? This low is 2630. This low at 6 a.m. is 2629. Yeah. So this is the low of the day that was printed at 6 a.m. Then the high of the day was at 11:15 a.m., which is just 15 minutes after New York's close. Then finally we had this example where we had this swing high at 1:45 a.m. during London, just before London's open. Then we had the high of the day being printed at 6:45 a.m. Then the lowest low or the low of the day at 15:30 p.m. during that day. So you can see this just a quick overview or a quick back testing of this theory, but you want to also go into more pairs, into more examples where you're outlining those highs and lows of the day. So we're going to look at examples where now setup examples where we are going to showcase this setup and this strategy in action. So I really hope to see you in the next lessons. So thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next lesson.